In the stillness of a Meccan night, when the city lay hushed beneath a sky heavy with stars and the ancient stones of the Kaaba cast long shadows across the silent courtyard, a moment unfolded that would transcend time, geography, and human comprehension. A moment that would come to be remembered as the greatest journey in history, the Isra and the Miraj, not merely as an event, but as a divine encounter that reshaped the spiritual axis of the world. And to understand its magnitude, one must first step into the world as it was then, into a city hardened by tradition, pride, and resistance, where Muhammad ibn Abdullah, the messenger of God, walked burdened by grief heavier than any stone idol that ringed the sanctuary. For this was the year of sorrow, the year in which he had buried his beloved wife Khadija, the first to believe in him, the fortress of his heart and the anchor of his mission, and his uncle Abu Talib, his shield against Quraysh hostility, and with their passing, the protection around him collapsed, exposing him to mockery, persecution, and violence that intensified with each passing day, as the Quraysh tightened their grip, ridiculed his message, and dismissed his call to monotheism as madness or magic, while children pelted him with stones and leaders plotted to silence him. And when hope seemed dim in Mecca, he turned his gaze outward, walking to Taif, seeking refuge and listeners, only to be rejected with cruelty so severe that his sandals filled with blood and his body collapsed beneath grapevines, where he prayed not for vengeance but for guidance, revealing the depth of his character even in despair. And it was in this crucible of sorrow, exhaustion, and isolation that the divine response descended, not in the form of immediate victory or worldly power, but through a journey that would affirm his prophethood beyond all doubt and bind the heavens and the earth through him. For one night, as authentically preserved in the earliest Sirah accounts of Ibn Ishaq, the meticulous narration of Safiur Rahman Mubarakpuri, the exegetical depth of Ibn Kathir, and the scholarly rigor of Muhammad Hamidullah, the prophet was awakened near the sacred mosque, and the angel Jibril appeared, not as a distant vision, but as a living presence, bringing with him the Burak, a creature unlike anything known to man, radiant, swift, neither beast nor angel, whose stride reached the farthest horizon. And with divine permission, the prophet mounted, leaving behind Mecca's darkness as the night itself seemed to part before him, carrying him across deserts and valleys at a speed that defied human measure, stopping at sacred stations where prophets before him had stood, each pause echoing with unseen prayers, until the journey reached its first monumental destination, the blessed precinct of Masjid al-Aqsa in Jerusalem, a land steeped in prophetic memory, where Abraham, David, Solomon, Moses, and Jesus had walked. And there, in a scene that collapses centuries into a single breath, Muhammad led all the prophets in prayer, standing at the forefront not by lineage or conquest, but by divine appointment, sealing the continuity of revelation and confirming that his message was not a rupture, but the culmination of a sacred chain. And from this earthly sanctuary the ascent began, the Miraj, a rising not of the body alone, but of existence itself, as the heavens opened one by one, each gate guarded and questioned, each answered with affirmation. And in the first heaven Adam greeted him, in the second Jesus and John, in the third Joseph radiant with beauty, in the fourth Idris elevated in rank, in the fifth Aaron beloved by his people, in the sixth Moses burdened by the trials of his nation, and in the seventh Abraham reclining near the lote tree of the furthest boundary, al-Sidrat al-Muntaha, beyond which no created being had passed. And as the prophet moved upward, the universe transformed, sounds faded, forms dissolved, and meanings deepened, until language itself strained to follow. And there he was shown signs that no eye had seen, rivers of milk and honey, realms of reward and warning, the architecture of the unseen, not as abstract ideas, but as living realities. And at the pinnacle of this ascent, beyond time, beyond place, he stood in proximity to his Lord, in a manner befitting divine majesty, where the obligation of prayer was bestowed, first 50, then through repeated return and counsel with Moses, reduced to 5, yet carrying the reward of 50, a mercy embedded within duty, binding believers across generations to a daily rhythm that mirrored this celestial ascent. And when the journey concluded and he returned to Mecca before the night had fully surrendered to dawn, the world appeared unchanged, yet nothing was the same, for the man who rose that morning carried within him the weight of heaven. And when he spoke of it, the reactions were swift and merciless. The Quraysh laughed, mocked, and seized upon the improbability of traveling to Jerusalem and back in a single night, dragging him to the Kaaba to recount details they believed he could not know. Yet he described Masjid al-Aqsa with precision, its doors, its layout, its surroundings, and caravans returning from Syria confirmed his words, while Abu Bakr, upon hearing the account, uttered words that sealed his title as al-Siddiq, declaring that if Muhammad said it, it was truth, and thus belief itself was tested, separating faith rooted in trust from faith shackled to material limitation. And this was the beginning of the journey's earthly impact, not as spectacle, but as criterion, a dividing line between hearts open to the unseen and minds imprisoned by arrogance. And as the days passed and persecution continued, the Isra and Miraj remained not an escape from suffering, but a source of resilience, embedding within the Prophet and his followers a certainty that their struggle was witnessed beyond the stars, that their prayers ascended as he once had, and that hardship on earth did not negate honor in the heavens, setting the stage for the unfolding chapters of history that would carry this message far beyond Mecca's valleys and into the destiny of nations. And it is from this turning point, where grief met grace and isolation met elevation, that the deeper ramifications of this night would begin to ripple outward, shaping theology, law, spirituality, and civilization itself, as the journey that began in silence prepared the world for transformation yet to come.
And as the echo of that extraordinary night settled into the consciousness of the small and embattled Muslim community, the Isra and Mi'raj began to exert its profound influence, not merely as a miraculous tale, but as a living force, reshaping belief, endurance, and identity in real time. For in the days that followed, Mecca did not soften its stance. The Quraysh did not retreat into reflection, and persecution did not lessen. Yet something within the believers had fundamentally changed, because the prophet now spoke with the authority of one who had seen beyond the veil, whose certainty was no longer only anchored in revelation heard, but in realities witnessed. And this certainty flowed outward, steadying hearts that trembled under torture and boycott, strengthening men like Bilal, whose cries beneath the scorching sun were answered by the knowledge that the heavens themselves bore witness, and women like Sumaya, whose martyrdom would be sealed with eternal honor. And it was in this atmosphere that the 5 daily prayers took root, no longer simply commands, but living reenactments of ascent. Moments when every believer, regardless of station or suffering, was granted a share in the prophet's journey, standing, bowing, prostrating as if climbing rung by rung toward divine presence. And this ritual, revealed not on earth but beyond the heavens, became the spine of the emerging Muslim identity, disciplining time, uniting hearts, and transforming scattered individuals into a community aligned not by tribe but by submission. While Jerusalem, long revered yet distant, was now bound directly to Mecca through sacred memory, establishing Masjid al-Aqsa as the second holiest sanctuary, a symbol of continuity with earlier prophets and a reminder that Islam was never meant to be confined to one land or people. And as Tafsir ibn Kathir meticulously records, the Quranic verse revealed shortly thereafter did not dwell on spectacle but on purpose, declaring the journey as a sign, an ayah, emphasizing that God showed his servant certain signs, not to entertain but to instruct. And this distinction mattered deeply, for the prophet never used the Isra and Mi'raj to demand belief through awe alone, instead allowing it to serve as a silent measure of faith, where belief was chosen rather than coerced. and the Quraysh, sensing danger in this quiet strength, intensified their efforts, attempting to fracture the community by exploiting fear and doubt, bringing travelers from Jerusalem to challenge the prophet's descriptions, only to find his answers precise and unwavering, while caravans arriving from Syria confirmed details he could not have known by conventional means. Yet even then, many hardened their hearts, demonstrating that miracles do not compel belief when arrogance blinds the soul. And amid this tension, the prophet continued his mission with renewed resolve, teaching, guiding, and preparing his followers for a future that was slowly taking shape beyond Mecca's walls. For the Isra and Miraj had not only affirmed divine support, but subtly signaled that the center of gravity was shifting, that Mecca, in its rejection, was no longer the sole horizon of destiny. And when delegations from Yathrib began to arrive during the pilgrimage seasons, listening in secret to the message of Islam, they encountered a prophet whose authority was unmistakable, whose words carried the weight of heaven, and whose endurance under persecution testified to a truth greater than any worldly ambition. And when the pledges of Aqaba were made, binding these new believers to protect him as they would their own families, it was the unseen groundwork laid by the night journey that made such trust conceivable, because the man they pledged to defend was not merely a preacher driven from his city, but a messenger honored above the heavens. And thus, the hijrah, the migration that would redefine history, did not emerge in isolation, but as the earthly continuation of a journey that had already bridged worlds. And as the Muslims prepared to leave behind everything familiar, their homes, wealth, and tribal security, the memory of the Isra and Miraj remained a silent companion, a reminder that distance and hardship meant nothing when God himself could carry his servant across creation in a single night. And even the prophet's own heart, though steadfast, bore the weight of what lay ahead. Yet the night he spent in Abu Bakr's house planning the migration was illuminated by the certainty born from that earlier night, when fear had given way to divine proximity. And once in Medina, as the first Islamic society began to take shape, the legacy of the Isra and Miraj continued to manifest in law, worship, and worldview, shaping the orientation of prayer, the sanctity of Jerusalem, and the understanding of leadership itself. For the prophet ruled not as a king, but as a servant entrusted with a mission that transcended earthly authority. And as battles were fought, treaties signed, and communities transformed, the memory of the ascent remained embedded in the collective consciousness, reminding believers that victory and defeat alike were temporary stations on a much longer journey. And when the prophet stood years later in Mecca after its peaceful conquest, surrounded by those who had once mocked him, the arc from that lonely night to this moment revealed its full meaning. For the man who had been ridiculed for claiming to travel to Jerusalem and beyond had now returned not as a conqueror seeking revenge, but as a messenger of mercy, fulfilling the divine promise embedded within his journey, that elevation comes through humility and power through submission. And even after his passing, when grief once again shook the community, the Isra and Miraj endured as a source of orientation, reminding Muslims that death itself was not an end but a passage, that the soul's journey mirrored that of the prophet's body and spirit on that night. And as Islamic civilization expanded across continents, carrying with it architecture, scholarship, law, and spirituality, the imprint of that journey could be traced in domes aligned toward the heavens, in call to prayer echoing across cities, in mystics seeking nearness to God through inner ascents, and in scholars grounding belief in disciplined practice rather than unchecked wonder, ensuring that the Isra and Miraj remained balanced between miracle and meaning. And now, centuries removed, yet spiritually bound to that night, its legacy continues to pulse through history, reminding humanity that in moments of deepest sorrow, when rejection feels absolute and the path forward obscured, elevation may come not through conquest or recognition, but through a journey unseen by the world, yet recorded forever in the fabric of existence. And it is here, as the story approaches its final horizon, that the true greatness of the journey reveals itself, not merely as a miracle confined to a single night, but as a turning point that reoriented time, space, and destiny, preparing the world for a message that would outlive empires and echo until the end of days. And as the years advanced and the mission of Muhammad ibn Abdullah reached its earthly completion, the meaning of that night continued to unfold with ever greater clarity, because the Isra and Miraj was never meant to be confined to the retelling of wonders, but to serve as a lens through which the entire prophetic life could be understood. And when the Prophet delivered his farewell sermon on the plains of Arafat, addressing tens of thousands who had once been scattered and persecuted, his words echoed with the same divine authority he had carried when standing beyond the heavens, emphasizing equality, justice, trust, and accountability before God, principles that mirrored the cosmic order he had witnessed on his ascent. And when he returned to Medina weakened by illness, his final days were marked not by despair, but by composure, repeatedly instructing the community to safeguard prayer, that very gift of the Miraj, because it was prayer that tethered earth to heaven after the Prophet himself would no longer walk among them. And when his soul departed this world, leaving behind a grief so immense that even Umar ibn al-Khattab struggled to comprehend it, it was Abu Bakr who steadied the community with words rooted in the same certainty that had defined him on the morning of the night journey, reminding them that Muhammad was a messenger who had passed like those before him, while God alone remained eternal. And thus the community moved forward, not clinging to the physical presence of the Prophet, but to the path he had illuminated, a path whose spiritual summit had been revealed on that night of ascent. And as Islam expanded beyond Arabia into the lands of Persia, Byzantium, Egypt, and beyond, the Isra and Miraj became deeply woven into Islamic consciousness, shaping not only belief but imagination, art, architecture, and scholarship, inspiring scholars like Ibn Abbas to reflect on its meanings, theologians to articulate its doctrinal implications, jurists to anchor worship in its commands, and mystics to interpret it as a map of the soul's journey toward God, while always grounding its reality firmly within orthodox belief, neither reducing it to metaphor nor allowing it to dissolve into unchecked speculation, maintaining the balance that the Prophet himself embodied. And Jerusalem, sanctified forever by that night, remained a spiritual axis within the Muslim world, its significance renewed with every generation, its loss and liberation carrying echoes of that first heavenly connection, while Masjid al-Aqsa stood as a silent witness to the unity of revelation and the universality of Islam. And across centuries of triumph and tragedy, from the heights of Andalusia to the devastation of Baghdad, from the minarets of Istanbul to the quiet prayer spaces of distant lands, the 5 daily prayers continued to punctuate human time with divine remembrance, reenacting the rhythm of ascent and return, reminding believers that no matter how fractured the world appeared, a direct line to the Creator remained open. And it was this enduring accessibility, born of the Isra and Miraj, that preserved the vitality of Islam through eras of decline and renewal alike, ensuring that faith was never confined to history books, but lived daily in hearts and homes. And even in the modern age, marked by skepticism and material obsession, the night journey stands as a challenge to reductionist views of reality, asserting that existence is larger than what is measured, that meaning is not exhausted by what is seen, and that moments of profound transformation often arrive not at the peak of worldly success, but in the depths of trial, just as they did for the Prophet in that sorrow-laden year in Mecca. And thus, when one looks back across the full sweep of history, from the silence of the sacred mosque to the vastness of the heavens, from persecution to civilization, from grief to legacy, the Isra and Miraj emerges not merely as an episode, but as a fulcrum upon which destiny turned, a night in which despair was met with elevation, isolation with communion, and human limitation with divine possibility. And in that single journey, compressed into a fragment of time yet expansive enough to encompass eternity, lies the enduring reminder that history is not driven solely by armies and empires, but by moments when the unseen touches the seen, reshaping the course of humanity forever. And so the greatest journey in history does not end with the return to Mecca before dawn, nor with the passing of the prophet, nor with the closing of any era, but continues every time a believer stands in prayer, lifts their gaze beyond the immediate world, and remembers that once, in the darkest hour, a servant was taken by night, and through him the path between earth and heaven was opened for all time.
And yet, even as the outward narration seems to reach its resting place, the final dimension of this journey demands to be unfolded. Because the Isra and Miraj did not merely close a chapter in the life of the prophet, but opened an enduring horizon that would continue to shape the inner life of the Muslim community long after the last battles were fought and the last sermons delivered. For in the generations that followed, as the companions dispersed across the world carrying fragments of memory and oceans of devotion, they carried with them an unshakable certainty that the universe was ordered by meaning and watched over by mercy. A certainty rooted not only in Scripture, but in the lived reality that their prophet had crossed realms while awake and returned unchanged in humility. And this understanding profoundly influenced how early Muslims viewed power, knowledge, and suffering, because rulers who truly absorbed the lesson of the night journey understood that authority was a trust rather than a prize. Scholars recognized that intellect without reverence was incomplete, and ordinary believers learned that hardship was not evidence of abandonment, but often the prelude to nearness, just as it had been in the year of sorrow. And as Islamic scholarship matured, theologians carefully preserved the balance of the Isra and Miraj, affirming its literal occurrence while extracting from it layers of wisdom, guarding it from both denial and exaggeration, ensuring that it remained a source of awe anchored in discipline, while the sciences of tafsir, hadith, and sirah treated the event not as an isolated miracle, but as an interpretive key to understanding prayer, revelation, and the unique station of Muhammad among the prophets. And across cultures, the journey inspired language that stretched toward the ineffable, poetry that sought to describe ascent without dissolving into fantasy, and architecture that lifted domes and minarets skyward as if echoing that original vertical movement between earth and heaven, while always returning the believer back to the ground, to prostration, to humility. Because the greatest ascent in Islam is completed not by rising above others, but by lowering oneself before God. And this paradox, revealed so vividly on that night, preserved the faith from becoming an abstraction detached from ethics. And as centuries passed and empires rose and fell, the Isra and Miraj quietly endured as a source of spiritual resistance, reminding believers under colonial domination, political fragmentation, or moral confusion that their connection to God was never mediated by worldly power, that even when lands were lost and institutions weakened, the path between the servant and the Creator remained intact, 5 times a day, open to all. And in this way, the journey continued to defeat despair across ages, offering a metaphysical anchor when history grew turbulent. And in moments when the Muslim world questioned its place in a rapidly changing global order, thinkers returned again to that night, not to escape reality, but to reframe it, understanding that the Prophet's journey had not bypassed human struggle, but dignified it by situating it within a cosmic narrative. And so the Isra and Miraj stands at the intersection of heaven and history, a reminder that revelation does not negate human effort, but ennobles it, that spiritual elevation does not cancel responsibility, but intensifies it, and that the ultimate honor granted to Muhammad was not dominion over the world, but nearness to God, combined with unwavering service to humanity.
And thus the journey's final meaning unfolds not in the heavens where words fail, but on earth where its imprint continues to be felt. In every act of patience chosen over bitterness, in every prayer performed despite exhaustion, in every moral stand taken without applause, echoing the silent strength of a prophet who rose above the heavens yet returned to walk among people. And in this convergence of the transcendent and the ordinary lies the enduring power of the greatest journey in history, a journey that began in the depths of sorrow, passed through the heart of the universe, and returned to illuminate the human path forward, not as legend or escape, but as a living truth that continues to shape souls, civilizations, and destinies until the final hour.